Um, Thank you, Nadia, set up the recording for today's session. So why are we recording today's session? We want to make a record for those that are unable to join today to watch back at another time that suits them. And it's also an opportunity for us to look back and reflect on the experience for us. So great, glad to see your people writing in the chat, people from in Mozambique, Djibouti, in London. Great to have you with us today. Today's session, we're going to be looking at informed consent and managing distress when collecting data for a humanitarian response. Informed consent and managing distress when collecting data for a humanitarian response. So if you just joined the call, there is live translation in Ukrainian or Polish. If you go down to the bottom of the screen in Zoom, you should see a globe with the word interpretation underneath, and you can select the languages Polish or Ukrainian if you find that helpful. This channel is English, and we are inviting people to type in the chat to introduce yourself, type your name, your job, your organization, your location. We invite you to write in English just so that for my facilitation I can respond to your comments, but for the audio we do have Polish and Ukrainian translation. Super, great. People calling from Nigeria, Ukraine, fantastic. Brilliant. So we'll just give a couple more minutes to see who else is able to join the call live. We are recording it, so if people haven't been able to join, they can watch it back later on. So just take a moment to introduce yourself, and I will introduce myself now. I realised I hadn't done that. So my name is Tom Russell. I'm a learning solutions specialist. I started my humanitarian career in Haiti. Some of you may be familiar with the history. In 2010, there was a earthquake, and then in 2011, a cholera outbreak. So I was there during the cholera outbreak. I've also worked in Madagascar, where we were supporting communities become more prepared and resilient in the face of cyclones coming in off the Indian Ocean. And I worked in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we also had epidemics, notably the Ebola outbreak of 2018. And since February of this year, I've been working for the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, and we are an organization set up to provide learning and training support to the humanitarian sector. You can check us out online, Humanitarian Leadership Academy, and we'll talk a bit more about us at the end of the session as well. So myself and Nadia, who is here on support, we are both with the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. Great, fantastic. So I think we've got our core host, so we're going to make a start. I've got a few questions for you. So if you can type in the chat, great to see you introducing yourself. We've got people calling in from Poland, Afghanistan, India. Fantastic that we can have people from so many different locations joining us this afternoon. Question for you, please respond now to the question on the screen in your chat. What did you have for breakfast this morning? What did you have for breakfast this morning? Type your answer in the chat. We're going to be largely using the meeting chat for our discussions today. So what did you have for breakfast this morning? Type your answer in the chat. I'm trying to think for myself now what I had for breakfast. Oats and fruit, great. Hot tea, cup of tea, yes, great. Tea and milk, excellent. I apologize, but I can't read Ukrainian or Polish. If you're able to type in English, that's great, then I can respond to your comments. Great, okay, second question. Sandwiches, fresh vegetables, great. What will you do after work today? Second question, what will you do after work today? Great seeing the responses to the first question come in. Fresh rice, no, fantastic. Spinach and smoothie, that sounds intriguing. Some food from Myanmar. And a second question, please, feel free to answer both. Again, apologies that I can't read Ukrainian or Polish, so if you can make a contribution in English, please do. We can recommend to you to use DeepL. If you can use DeepL, you can type in your language and get the translation in English and pop that into the chat. That would be a way for me to make sure that I can understand and read your contributions. Great. So what are you doing after work today? Rest, get on Facebook, watch a bit of Netflix, chill out. Sounds good. Take a walk in the park. I have guests over preparing a dinner. Draw a picture. Great. Be creative. Seeing a sister, seeing a sibling, fantastic. That's great. What are you doing after work today? Well, I haven't answered this question. So what did I have for breakfast this morning? I had, let me think, I had some cereal and yogurt. And this after work today, it's nice weather in the UK, first time for a while, and I'm keen to go out cycling, watch the TV, do some cooking, fantastic. Another question for you. How did you feel when answering these questions? What thoughts went through your mind? How did you feel answering these questions in the chat? We're about 40 people. Perhaps we've not met before. Felt great, excellent, excited, fantastic. Easy, felt easy, great, happy, excellent. And did you wonder why we were asking these questions? Did anybody think, oh, why is Tom asking me what I had for breakfast this morning? Why is Tom asking me, what am I going to do for work after work today? Okay, so yes, some people were wondering, some not, but it looks like a lot of us were wondering. Thank you. So why did I start with these questions? Well, yes, I wanted to just get a chance to get to know you a bit, to warm up for our session, just to check that the chat functioning is working properly. This information here, we're not going to use for anything else. It's really just to get to know each other as we start this call. But what we wanted to highlight is that we're looking at informed consent today. So informed consent. Can anyone tell me what is informed consent? What is informed consent? Maybe think back to the questions we've just asked you. Can anyone type in the chat, what is informed consent? What do we mean by informed consent? That's what we're going to be looking at today. So today's session will be in two parts, informed consent and managing distress. Right, so when I was asking those questions in the chat, before I asked them, I didn't ask for your consent, permission, thank you. That's right. So when I asked those first questions on the orange slides, I didn't ask for your permission. I didn't say, may I ask you these questions? I just asked them straight away. That's right. To consent when we gather and collect data where the person understands the use of the data exactly. So informed consent implies that information about individuals belongs to those individuals. And those who use that information, if we're working in humanitarian responses and we're collecting information from the affected population, that we use the information on their behalf, and we should only use it in their best interest and with their informed consent. Fantastic. And can anybody tell me the difference between consent and informed consent? So we might say we get consent, but what's the difference between consent and informed consent? Can anybody tell me? You can type your answers in the chat. What do we mean by informed consent? Somebody had mentioned previously that people need to understand how we'll use the data. Sometimes it can be written. Sometimes it can be verbal. And we provide information to the person in advance. Exactly. So before we start collecting information from somebody, we explain, well, why are we collecting that information? What are we going to do with it? So informed consent means that the individual should receive full disclosure and achieve an understanding of how the information will be presented and used. So the person that we're asking information from should be able to understand how that information will be used. And that means also that they should have information about the wider context that is necessary to make a decision to decide whether they're happy to be involved in the data collection exercise, whether they're happy to answer our questions, because they know what that information is going to be used for. And they need to understand any possible negative consequences that may arise should there be any, in being involved in an interview, in data collection. To frame this session is all framed under data collection when we want to do a need assessment to those affected by a crisis. Great. We're now going to go to a poll. Nadia, if you can put the first poll up, I believe you can run that through Zoom. As we go through, if you have any questions about anything that we're looking at today, please feel free to type them in the chat. If you can start your question with a Q, that as just a Q on its own, and then the question, that helps me recognize that it's a question. Nadia, we're happy to start the first poll. Thank you very much. So you should see a poll appear on your screen, and got a couple of questions for you to answer about the content that we're looking at today. So why are we asking these questions? We want to get a feel, an idea of, okay, what experience do we have in using these tools, obtaining informed consent, and using distress plans? This helps me and Nadia as the facilitation team understand, okay, what experience do we already have? What do we need to look at together this afternoon? So please take a moment to answer the poll. Right. So Nadia, am I right to say that results will pop up once everybody's finished, or we close the poll and then we can see the results?
I'm not sure. I think people can see the results. Can they see them now, or I think I have to end the poll and then.
Okay, give a couple more minutes. Perhaps the poll should still be open. I understand we have Svetlana and Ivona translating the questions for people. So give yourselves a time to have that translation. Great. So for some people, it's the first time to hear about a distress plan. Nadia, can you see how many people have responded to the poll already?
Yep.
Are we close to everybody?
Or
nearly.
We've got about 15 responses for both.
Okay, just another minute. So take a moment. We're just keen to know what experience you already have using informed consent, obtaining informed consent, and what experience you have in using distress plans. And this is all framed within collecting data from a community or population affected by a crisis as a part of your humanitarian response work. So perhaps you're organizing a focus group discussion or an interview, or you're going house to house to collect information because you want to learn about the situation people find themselves in. Great.
Just to let you, Tom. Just to let you know, Tom. Ivana and Svetlana are just translating the questions right now.
Super, that's helpful. Thank you. Thank you for the feedback, Olivia. Yes, perhaps you've not had experience in obtaining informed consent or using a distress plan, and we haven't given the option that that's not available for you. Great. Nadia, should we close the poll and get a sense of what experience we have in the room? Fantastic. So when we asked you, do you obtain informed consent when collecting information from the affected population, 79% said yes, always. Some of us, very few of us rarely. And then distress plans, it looks like we don't have as much experience using. So 42% said yes, always, but we have a few who haven't done that or rarely do that. So we'll make sure we have enough time to look at distress plans in our session today. Thank you. Great. Now, we'd like to ask you to type in the chat based on the introduction that we've made. What do you want to learn during this webinar? So type in the chat, what do you want to learn during this webinar? What do you want to learn during this webinar? Please type in the chat. And at the end of the webinar, we'll come back to these to see if we've been able to touch upon them. And if we haven't, we can see if we can respond to them in the time at the end. So type in the chat, what do you want to learn during this webinar about informed consent, about distress plans? Right, distress plans, what is it and why do we use them? Is this related to my job? How do we make sure we conduct an assessment of quality? Great. What else do you want to learn during this webinar? So how to obtain consent from participants when doing research, better understanding of how to build a distress plan, fantastic. How this could apply to my volunteer work. When do we ask for informed consent and why do we do it? Fantastic. Great. I'm now going to ask you to imagine yourselves in a community that's been affected by a humanitarian crisis. This picture is just to give some inspiration. Please draw upon any context that you're familiar with in your location and try and put yourselves, just imagine that you are someone who's living in an area where you've been displaced. So imagine that you have had to leave your home. I'm just going to go back a slide for a moment, just to highlight this to everybody. Please be aware that the content in this webinar includes reference to emotional distress. This may be distressing for some individuals. If you need to leave the webinar at any time, feel free to do so. Just wanted to highlight that the content we will be looking at will be making reference to emotional distress, and we recognize that could be distressing for some individuals. So in our example, we're inviting you just to imagine yourself in a community where you've had to move, you've been displaced. You're now in an informal settlement camp or a center where informal accommodation has been provided for you. You imagine that you're there with your family, but perhaps one of your children has been suffering from a disease that you're concerned about, an illness, and you're keen to get access to healthcare for them. So for this exercise, we're just inviting you to imagine what it might be like for the person in this story. Try and put yourselves in their place. Now imagine that you hear a helicopter and you see a team of humanitarian aid workers lands nearby, and you're curious, you overhear voices and you notice a group descend from the helicopter and walk over towards the settlement. And like others around you, you're curious by their presence. What are they doing here? One of the people in the group comes to you, approaches you, and they have what looks like a big tablet, a big telephone in their hand, and they start asking you a series of questions. So I'm now going to ask you those questions, and we'd like to ask you to raise your hand, if any of these statements on the screen seem relevant to you, to this person that we've asked you to imagine in the place of. So here are the questions I'm going to put on the screen, and I'm going to read you some more questions now. So imagine you're still there, you're perhaps just outside your home, and I've come to ask you some questions. And I might ask you questions like, are there significant changes in the total amount of food that people are eating since the disaster on average in your community, in your family? What are the main sources of food in your community? What are the main concerns you have with meeting shelter needs? What are the traditional main sources of income people in your community have? As I'm asking these questions, I'd invite you to raise your hand if any of the statements on the screen apply to you. So raise your hand if any of the statements on the screen apply to you. So using the Zoom function, raise your hand. And I'm going to carry on asking these questions. So I've come to do an assessment, and I'm keen to learn about your situation, but let me ask you some more questions. Is there a serious problem in your community because people are not able to get adequate healthcare for themselves? Thank you. Yes, we will have some time for our translators to translate the context on the screen. So I'll just leave a moment now. Ivana, Svetlana, I'll leave you a couple of minutes to translate these questions on the screen. So raise your hand as I'm asking these questions. Raise your hand if any of these statements apply. So as I was asking you those questions about your community's needs, whether there are any problems in your community, whether you had any shelter needs, what your income came from in your community, did any of these statements, raise your hand, did any of these statements resonate with you? Did you feel comfortable? People are saying they felt comfortable. Did you get annoyed that I was asking so many questions? Perhaps you've just lost everything and you don't have time or the energy to respond to these questions. I can see some pluses. I imagine that's hands raised. Thank you very much. Would you assume that after answering these questions that we would come and give you something? Would you feel that you should exaggerate the situation and respond in a certain way so that you would get more support and more aid? So the reason why informed consent is so important is that, as we've already described, the people that we are looking to serve and support need to understand why we're asking these questions. If we're doing a needs assessment, they need to understand, well, why are you asking these questions and what are we going to do next? So what are the key elements of informed consent? So if you were to write a checklist of the elements that you want to make sure are included in your informed consent script, imagine it as a script, is that you arrive and you're doing a needs assessment. And the first thing you do is you read from the first page of your script. And that first page of your script is your informed consent. So what are the information, what are the things you need to do, that you need to say to the person that you want to get information from before you start asking questions? This is informed consent. So what do you think should go in that script? What are the key elements of informed consent? So imagine a script. It's the first thing you say before you start doing interviews. So you can lower your hand if you had your hand raised, and please answer in the chat. What would you include in your informed consent? What would you want to say to the person that you're interviewing or the focus group? Thank you. Introduce yourself. That's right. Introduce yourself. Introductions are really important. Your name. We introduce ourselves at the start of this call. Introduce yourself with your name of the project. Perhaps they've heard about the project. Perhaps they've seen posters or heard about it on the radio. Introduce yourself. That's right. Explain the purpose. Why are you there? What are you doing? Someone mentioned research earlier. So are you there for research or are you there for other needs? Exactly. You need to be very clear what is the purpose, not just of why you're there, but the purpose of this exercise. So why are you asking the questions? What's going to happen now? What else might you want to include in that opening script when you meet with the person you're looking to get information from for the first time? You've introduced yourself, you've explained the purpose of your activity. What else would you need to say in order that you have obtained informed consent? So the purpose of this script is to obtain informed consent. Informed consent is that people are willing to answer your questions, share information about themselves. Confidentiality. Yes, we might want to explain how the data will remain confidential. We might explain that we're not going to use their names. If we have a database of respondents, we might decide afterwards to anonymize the data, perhaps give every respondent a number or a code so that their name no longer is matched to their responses. Confidentiality is really important. Good. Will the person that we're speaking to get feedback later on? So will they learn about what we go and do next? Will there be a time when we can meet with them again? Will we be coming back? Exactly, that's really important. That's right. If we're taking photographs, if we're doing some data collection to describe the situation of what's happening, to post that in our media channels, we do also need to have their permission for using their story. That's also another key reason for you obtaining informed consent. So informed consent is used primarily for collecting information and data as part of an assessment, an interview, a questionnaire, but also when we are collecting stories to share about a person's experience as we perhaps want to raise funds or awareness of a situation. We may want to leave context if they need further information. And if we're working with children, yes, we'd need informed consent from the parents, a certain age. I think we in Save the Children understand it's 18 years old is the limit for an adult. That might differ in different locations. But yes, if there's a child that we want to speak to, we need to make sure that their caregiver, their guardian, or their parent gives us that informed consent. Now, this is a 5-step checklist that we recommend to you. So I think you've got pretty much all of it here in the chat. I can see we need to first of all say, well, we say who we are, and we need to explain what we are asking them to do. So if we're asking them some questions, I was reading from a survey. I was reading from a standard needs assessment survey. So we'll need to explain, what are we asking them to do? We're asking them to answer a few questions. We need to explain how we're going to use their information. So if we're doing a needs assessment, we need to explain, well, we want to understand the needs of this community so that with the funding or resources we have, we can help us better design our response. But we need to be very careful not to be making promises for anything that we can't do, especially if we don't have funding for anything at the moment. We start to get into questions of, is it the right thing to do to be asking for information if we don't yet have resources? We're not going to be looking at that in this session today, but it's really important to explain how we'll use their information. Their rights as well is really key. So we can explain that the person answering the questions, if they want at any point to stop and stop answering the questions and end the interview, they can. Their rights are that they can remove, they can disclose their consent at any time. And how much time is in? So we've got another hour, we're going to have a 10-minute break. So timing is really important because we all have busy schedules. Today, all of us will have full schedules and we need to know what we're committing our time to. We're now going to look at an example of an informed consent script. I use the word script because it's often when you have an interview tool or a data collection tool, it's often at the start or the back as a reference for you. This comes from a data collection tool, which is an interview. So I appreciate our translators. You don't need to describe the text on the screen. This is a screenshot just to give an example of a tool. Personal histories. It's a interview tool that's done one-on-one with an individual, and there's one element where we ask the person to make a drawing. So I'm going to show you the script that sits at the start of this guide, and I'd like you to tell me, can you type in the chat, is there anything missing? Now, in your email, you should have received a copy of this document that you can see on screen in Polish and in Ukrainian. So if you can check your emails, you should see that. And now just ask you to take the time to read through this and think about those key 5 checklist steps that we listed just now. Is there anything missing from this informed consent, or does it have everything you need? So this is a script that we would ask to the people that we want to do an interview with. So take a moment to read through it and tell me, type in the chat, is there anything missing? Is there anything missing? So just take a moment to read through the screen. Time. Someone says you don't mention time. The time it will take. That's right. I think it's very comprehensive, very thorough, but you're right. Time is not mentioned. Anything else that's missing? Or do you think everything is there? So just take a moment to read through. This is the script that you would find at the start of an interview guide. What is missing? how the information will be used and how it will benefit them, the person that we're interviewing. Is that correct? And the legitimacy of the organization. So who are we? What's our mandate, perhaps? We need to give them the right to stop at any time if they feel uncomfortable. That's really important. Thank you. Great. Anything else that's missing? I think those are the key points that I noticed. So I popped up on the screen. Apologies, you don't have the translation for the text in red in Polish and Ukrainian. So I'll give it a moment for our translators to translate that. But the bits that are missing, how we use their information. So here we've added in the information you tell us will be used by people in our organization and will not be shared more broadly, so that we will keep that information within our organization. We're not going to share it more broadly. And also the things we learn will be used to design programs that will help people in communities and camps like yours. So that's explaining how we're going to use that information, how it might benefit them. We're not saying it's going to directly benefit them. We say here in this example, communities like yours. And then someone mentioned the time. The activity will take between 25 and 45 minutes. Now, appreciate that's quite a wide range, but I think we need to be careful at not saying it'll take 25 minutes and then it does take much longer. If you have any questions as we're going through, please feel free to pop them in the chat. So we wanted to give you another example of what a informed consent script looks like. This comes from a survey that I actually did recently, so I've hidden the name of the organization involved. But this I thought was a really good example. I'll just allow the translators to translate what's on the screen. So this survey will be collecting your responses and producing a findings report while we work closely with the organization over the coming months. Your response to this survey will remain anonymous and will only be presented in a collective form, e.g. as summaries, graphs, and pie charts. No organization will have access to the raw data and therefore will not be able to identify individual respondents. The only person who will have access to the raw data is project manager's name, who is managing the project, and the data will be held for 12 months following the completion of the project and then deleted. Great. So you should have the original file as a PDF in your emails in Ukrainian and Polish if you want to go back and look over it. And this was another example we wanted to share with you of what we think is a good example of a script that you could use for obtaining informed consent. So if you're preparing a needs assessment, we encourage you to sit down and with your team think through, right, what is our script? What is our script? So before you start doing a needs assessment or planning one, make sure you've thought through your script for obtaining informed consent. When else do we use informed consent? We've already talked briefly, someone mentioned about collecting photos and stories and images. Please type in the chat, when else do we use informed consent? So this webinar, we're looking at collecting data and information as part of the needs assessment, but when else do we use informed consent? In what other circumstances or situations in our work, if we're working in Ukrainian response, when else do we use informed consent? So it might be, as we said already, when we're collecting a story or when we want to speak to somebody about any sensitive data we may collect, or actually any data we collect. So if it's a survey, a feedback form, if we want to meet with someone, if we want to ask them for their time, ideally we should be using and obtaining informed consent in all circumstances, but particularly, yes, when we're collecting data or when we're collecting stories or photos for the media. Thank you very much. We're going to have a break in a couple of minutes. So just as we come to the break, just going to share some other tips we have for you when ensuring that you've obtained informed consent. So to make certain that there is informed consent, information should be delivered in the individual's own language with an opportunity of advice from a trusted adult if children are involved. So we're attempting to make this webinar as accessible as possible in Ukrainian and Polish. We haven't got this slide translated. We do have our translator, so I will let you help us with the translation now. Consent must be obtained in circumstances that ensure the person is not coerced intentionally or unintentionally. Be aware of the inherent power dynamic at play in representing a wealthy and influential aid organization, for example. Individuals say yes, perhaps, because they think that this is what they need to say in order to receive aid. And be mindful of asking for informed consent during times of extreme shock and distress, where individuals' judgments may be clouded. Allow a reasonable amount of time for consideration and be responsive if they later regret something that they agreed to in the heat of the moment. So make sure they have that opportunity to say, oh, actually, no, I don't want you to use that information anymore. And find out and become familiar with your own organization's policies and best practice for informed consent. We're now going to take a 10-minute break. If you have any questions during the break, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll respond to them. So we've completed that first section on informed consent. If you have any questions about informed consent, feel free to post them in the chat. We're taking a 10-minute break and we'll restart at 14:50 the time in Kyiv and 13:50 the time in Warsaw, and people on GMT +1, it's 12:50 when we will recommence. So 10-minute break. If you have any questions, pop them in the chat and we will respond. Thank you. Great. So I hope you had a bit of a chance to have a 10-minute break, stretch the legs, perhaps grab a coffee, drink for the rest of this session. So we're going to go through now for another 40 minutes until 1/2 the next hour. And if you could just raise your hand in Zoom just to indicate that, yep, you're back, you're ready. And we're going to be looking at the second half of this session on managing distress. So just raise your hand to indicate that you're ready, you're back. Fantastic. Thank you. Yep. An okay sign too is great. Thank you. Super. So as we go through this second half, again, if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. If we don't have time to answer them straight away, we will make sure we go through and answer them at the end. So if you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat. If you can put a letter Q at the start of your question, that helps me recognize that it's a question to respond to. Fantastic. Great. Super. Right. You can lower your hands now. You can lower your hands, and we're going to get a start on the second part, looking at managing distress. First question for you. So you can lower your hands. Thank you very much. First question, type your answer in the chat. If you're going on a journey, perhaps a journey in a car, a 4x4, or a truck, or a motorbike, what safety checks will you do before setting off? What safety checks will you do? What will you check? Perhaps about the vehicle, or what will you want to check before you head off on your journey to make sure that your journey will be safe? So type your answers in the chat. What safety checks will you do before setting off? So perhaps imagine you're going off to do a needs assessment in a community, and you're going to make a journey of a few hours to get there, or perhaps a full day. What safety checks will you do before setting off? Type your answer in the chat. So think about the vehicle, think about the people you're with, weather. Very good. Yeah, it looks pretty stormy, doesn't it, Jerry? Looks stormy on the screen there. So check the weather. Exactly, Alexandra. Check the news in the region where you're traveling to. Find out the context, exactly the security, Hamza. Find out the security context of where you're going. And what about the practicalities? Apologies, Anna. Again, I apologize. I don't read Ukrainian or Polish. If you do want to type in the chat in English, please do jump into, if you can open DeepL translator, then that would give me a chance to read your comments. So apologies for that. Thank you. What about the practicalities of your vehicle? What are you going to check about your vehicle before you set off? What might the wheels exactly? What are you going to check about the wheels? I recently had a puncture in my car. I had to change, ended up changing all the wheels in the end. So you might have to check the wheels. Yeah, so you want to make sure it's physically safe, right? Check the technical condition of the car. Are there any military operations along the way? Yes, you need to be aware of who you might encounter on the route, if there's any checkpoints that you need to be aware of. And what about you as a team? What about you as the team, the driver? Do you need to make any checks about them? Yep, check the security situation in the community. What about your driver? Would you want to check anything with them before you set off? Sleep time. Yep, good point, Jerry. Has that person had enough time to recuperate from their last shift? Are they well enough rested to make the journey? How long will the journey be? Can we do it in one go, for example? Great. Now, medical kit. Yep, medication, medical kit in case you get stuck and you need supplies, or in case something happens, an accident happens, an itinerary to know what you're going to do, the travel time, the route you're going to take. Now, what about distress? What about distress for your team? Have you thought about making a plan for distress? Now, we might start thinking, well, what do we mean by distress? I'm going to ask a first question that will help us answer that. Now, again, only respond if you feel happy to. No need to respond to this question if you don't feel comfortable to. Has anyone started to cry when you're having a conversation with them? Has anyone started to cry when you were having a conversation with them? anyone started to cry when you had a conversation with them? Okay. So this might not be something that we've had much experience of. For some of us, we might not have much experience of this. For others, yes, we might do. Might be people that are in the affected community, might be people that we're close to, our friends. And when that happened, for those of you who've had that experience, how did you feel? What did you do? So when you were having that conversation, the other person started crying, how did you feel? What did you do? How did you feel? Again, if you don't feel comfortable responding to this question in the chat, that's totally fine. Just have a think for yourself. Yeah, perhaps you didn't feel comfortable. Emotions came up for yourself. Maybe you felt awkward or guilty, perhaps, but there's an emotional reaction in ourselves as well. That's right. So when we're talking about in distress plans, we're referring to when we go and collect data and information from people affected by a crisis, there's a high probability or risk, there's a risk that the person that we're speaking to has experienced something traumatic or emotional. And even the simplest of questions can lead to an emotional response. For example, how many of you have asked a question early on in your form saying, how many people live in this household? How many people live in this household? That's a common question to ask at the start of an interview. Have you asked that question before? So there might be perhaps other reasons why people are crying, and we need to respect that. But even if we ask what seems like a simple question, how many people live here? This happened not in my case, but in someone I'm aware of who they asked that first question, and the person they were speaking to did start to cry and break down into tears because last week there were 5 people living in the house, and this week there are only 3. So even what seems a very simple question, we need to be really sensitive and careful. And to help us do that, we need to create a distress plan, a plan that tells us in advance, what are we going to do if we find ourselves in that situation where either the person that we're speaking to is having an emotional distress response, perhaps we see that because they're crying, or a member of the team asking the questions is having a response. Someone mentioned in the chat that you were feeling emotional when somebody else was crying. It's a very common question, how many people live in a household? Now, to help us work through this, the first step is I'm going to put this question on the board. The first question to ask, well, what do you know about the current context? Not necessarily the security context, but what's happened in that area, in that context, that could lead a traumatic experience to the people that we're meeting with. So that means becoming aware of what may have created distress for the people you're going to meet first. That's the first thing to do. Now, we're going to use something called mural board. Mural board is like a big whiteboard, and you'll be able to put your post-it notes on there. Now, Nadia and I just have to make sure it's set up correctly. I'm going to show you what it looks like, and then Nadia will post that in the chat. Nadia, remind me the access settings I need to have on here, please.
So I just noticed that if you go and share and then settings, that you need to make sure anyone with the link can access, as opposed to having to manually.
I think it's okay. So if you share the understand contacts and impact A to L link, so Nadia is going to share a link in the chat, and this is mural. So it's a whiteboard function, and you see in the middle there are these yellow squares. They're like yellow post-it notes. So on here you can type your text. And once you've typed your text, you can then move it across underneath the question. So we've got a few questions, but we're going to start with this first question. You see there's the same questions, the same on either side. So you should be able to type your text in the yellow box, the yellow square, and then move that across to answer the question, what do you know about the current context? So here, we're inviting you to think about your context, the context where you're working in, the context where you're going to do data collection. What do you know about the current context that could lead to a traumatic experience for the people that you're working with? So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to write that out. And if you can make your comments in English, that'd be really helpful for us. And you can use DeepL to translate your comments into English if that's helpful for you. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and you should see that on the screen, and we should see some answers coming up as we go. So what do you know about the current context? Add your ideas into the mural board. And the link should be in the chat. So if you have any questions about this exercise, do let us know. Type in the chat to me or Nadia. We're asking the question, what do you know about the current context? And add your answers in the chat. So if you can type your text and place it underneath the question, like so, that'd be great. And if you can type in English, that'd be great. Then we can interact and engage with the questions. So, oh, brilliant, thank you. Just give you 5 minutes to think about, but this is the first thing we need to be aware of. So before we go on our journey, we're thinking about the practical security aspects, but also the context of what's happened in this community. Have there been any traumatic events that we need to be aware of? What are the events that could have caused distress for this community that we need to be aware of? So just give you a few more minutes to respond in the mural board. So we're asking us to think about, well, the first step in preparing a distress plan is to become more familiar with the current context. What might be the events that have taken place that could have been traumatic for people that we need to be aware of before we start arriving in communities and asking questions, collecting information. So I'm just going to share the mural board as it's building. Let's give you a couple more minutes to think about, okay, what do we know about the current context? So if we don't know, then the first thing we need to do is go and find out before perhaps we start a visit or organize a need assessment, is to learn and ask people what's happening in this area. What are the events that have happened recently? So perhaps looking through a timeline of what's been happening, speaking to community leaders. Yeah, and some really helpful comments about language being posted in the mural board. What language should we use? We need to be careful with humor. Are there certain jokes that we shouldn't be using? Find out experience from previous researchers. Get an understanding of the meaning of common words, perhaps words that we use in our work or in our way of speaking have a different meaning in the communities that we go and collect data from. So I'm going to leave that open and we're going to stay in the mural board, and there is another couple of questions, question 2 and question 3. Question 2, what impact might these events have on your participants, so the affected population, and what impact might these events have on you? So think about the impact the events in that context might have on your participants or might have on you. So again, think about your own context that you're familiar with. And if you keep yourself in the mural board, you'll see, if you scroll down the mural board, there are those 2 other questions, question 2 and question 3. So Nadia, if you can reshare the link to the mural board, please. I think it's the one just above, just in the messages now, but thank you, that's great. So just going to take a few more minutes, about 5 more minutes. The reason we're doing this is that the first step before we start preparing a distress plan, it's important to understand the context and to think about how that context might impact the people that we're meeting with and ourselves. So when I say context, I'm referring to events that may have been traumatic, events that may have created distress or an emotional response. So take a few more minutes to add your comments to the mural board. And if you're having any difficulties accessing the mural board, let Nadia or I know. Appreciate it's perhaps a new format, new tool to use, and sometimes it doesn't quite do what we want it to do. So it's going to give you a few more minutes to work through that. I can see people typing, and for participants that we're meeting with, it may mean that they remember difficult times. It might bring back to their mind hard moments, and that can bring emotion. But for ourselves as well, as we hear these stories and we learn about traumatic experiences from the people we're meeting with, that can also make us feel sad. It's important to be aware of that and aware that that might happen. Yeah, and the people that we're meeting with, they may get upset. That's right, and events may leave participants traumatized. Person may have had physical injuries that's led to a physical disability. People may be managing stress or trying to manage stress. And our response, yes, people are mentioning compassion, sympathy, empathy. Yes, there's a response often from us that bears a desire to comfort, to respond in some way. So great to see the comments being added to the mural board. So the first part of preparing a distress plan, I'm going to go back to our slide deck, is answering these questions, these 3 questions. What do you know about the current context? What impact might these events have on you and your participants? And what impact these events might have on you? So from what you've described, we realize that distress manifests itself. We as interviewers can become overwhelmed with emotion, or the people we're meeting with may become overwhelmed with emotion. And so we need to have a plan in place to manage that. We need a plan in place to manage that. So for interviewees, we're going to just step through a four-step framework. Once we observe or we have a notice of a sense of, this person is experiencing distress, there are these different response levels that we can follow up with. And there are some guiding questions to help us think about what to do when that happens. So the first question is that we need to become aware of is, what are the symptoms of distress? So to be able to recognize that someone is experiencing distress, first of all, we need to know what those symptoms are. So I'm just going to ask you to type in the chat now. What are the symptoms of distress? What are the symptoms of distress? So come back into the main room, as it were, and type in the chat. What are the main symptoms of distress? We've talked about them already. What are the main symptoms of distress? A change in emotions. That's right. What might we see? Crying outwardly, stop talking. Yeah. What else might we observe? Perhaps someone is talking too much, or they could be withdrawn. So it can be really varied, the response that we see to distress that someone is experiencing. But there are some common symptoms. So for example, maybe the person is shaking or fidgeting or no longer making eye contact. They might say explicitly, I cannot continue. It's very different. It can depend from person to person. But as we prepare our distress plan, it's helpful to have an idea of what to look out for. It's like a checklist, like our script for our informed consent. We have a checklist in our plan to know that, okay, distress is happening, because perhaps we're very focused on our work and we can forget, we can be very absorbed with the questions we're asking, making sure we ask all the questions we need to for our assessment. But yes, we need to be aware of, are there changes in voice? Are people staring into space? Are they unresponsive? A loss of appetite, that's right. That might be something we observe in a focus group discussion. If there is food part being offered around and some people are deciding not to have any. What's the first thing you can do? Imagine you're, oh, excuse me, I think I've gone to the wrong slide. I will go back to the one I wanted to. So imagine you are the interviewer. What do you do in the moment? You've noticed someone is in distress. You've got your list of symptoms on your checklist, and you start seeing some of those happen for the person that you're interviewing or the person you're collecting data from. What should you do straight away? Type in the chat. What do you do? What do you do straight away? What's the first thing you do when you notice someone you're interviewing is in distress? You could end the interview. That might be the most appropriate thing to do. And before you do that, what might you do? pause. Yeah, pause the interview. Just take a moment and say, okay, we're going to stop here. Exactly. Ask if the person needs to take a break. That's really good. Yeah, give them time to think about what's happening. And we can ask them, are they happy to keep going? We could decide, it could be very clear that no, we're going to end the interview, but we've got to this stage where they're willing to share something. And so we respect that and we give them the opportunity. We say, we pause the interview, we ask, how are you feeling? Do you want to stop? And people were typing in the mural board about having compassion and empathy. So we express our support. We can't say that we know what they're going through. We don't, but we can acknowledge that we're seeing the person is distressed. And perhaps we suggest a break. We say, let's all have a break. Let's all have a break. We could also ask neutral questions about other topics. So we can, a distress can be a bit like a wave, and we need to be careful if people are getting too high on the wave to say, right, okay, we need to ask some neutral questions. So we change the subject maybe and try and find some neutral questions to ask about other topics. If we still see the person, so if we carry on, and as someone said, if we see that the person is too stressed to continue, so we've realized that, oh no, they can't continue, that they are too distressed, what do we do then? So we've got to, this is the level 2 that we've put in our framework. What's the next thing we do? They're too stressed to continue. What happens next? Do we simply end the interview and walk away? What do we need to be aware of? Yes, we stop the interview. We acknowledge that the person is too distressed, in too much distress to continue, and we explain, yes, we will draw this interview or focus group discussion to a close. What do we do then? Think about something we haven't touched upon in this session yet, but underpins our work, is the principle of do no harm. Do no harm. So think about the principle, perhaps you're already familiar with it, but if you're not, the principle of do no harm is that any interaction or anything we do where we're looking to help someone or support someone or respond to a need, we need to be aware that we may create negative consequences. So here we're doing an interview, a person's in distress, that person's in distress as a result of our interview, our intervention. So we need to think about, well, how can we now look out for the emotional needs of that person? Yeah, good idea, Abu Bakar. Find an activity that will help them calm down. We stop the interview, but we don't stop the interaction. We stop the interview, but we need to be aware that, and under our mandate of do no harm, we need to make sure that person is okay. And if we can, we may not be able to do that ourselves. We may need to bring in somebody else from the community or another team member, but here's some recommendations for you. Stop the interview, yes, give time and space for the person to manage their emotions. You might want to walk the person to a safe place. So perhaps where you were in itself has triggered emotions. Make sure they're not left alone. And you can also ask for their consent to connect them with a mental health worker. Yeah, thank you. Stop the intervention, stop the interview, but not the interaction. That's right. And so this question here of social network as well, connect them with someone in their social network. Understanding what these services that are available, that's part of that first preparation we're looking at, understanding the context. So it might seem like a distress plan is just a list of words, but no, there's perhaps some work for us to do. Are we aware of the mental health services that are available? Because if we have someone who's had a really serious reaction, we need, as our mandate of do no harm, we need to link them in with trusted professionals who can care for them if needed. And we may not be well placed to do that. So that's something just to keep in mind. The last point, follow up. So I think we've gone through all of those steps. The person that we're speaking is, the wave has descended and yeah, we're exchanging pleasantries again. We're talking about neutral things, but what is the last thing we need to think about? Oh, I've gone again to the wrong screen. Follow-up, referral. Thank you, Peru. So what supports can we provide after the interview or after the interaction if needed? So the interaction has stopped as well now. The interview stopped, the interaction has stopped, and we've made sure the person is okay from our perspective and with people to support them. But later on, do we need to follow up, or does it all end there? What would you recommend? And please do draw upon your own experiences for those who have experiences of working in similar situations. Please do share what you found effective and helpful. Yes, link up with professional help as soon as you can. That's right, it's really important. What else? What other supports can we provide if needed after the interview? So if there are no partners available, do we have anyone in our team who perhaps is trained in psychological first aid? Perhaps we have someone in our team that we can call upon, and then that makes us think about the unit we make up in our assessment team. We need perhaps to think about making sure we have someone who has those skills, has that training in psychological first aid. So from our recommendations for you, we could organize a follow-up with their consent. Perhaps if we know we're going to be in that location in a couple of weeks' time, we go back, we just check on how they're doing. And like you've said, we encourage them to connect with a health worker, with a professional. Now, we've been looking at that from the perspective of the interviewee experiencing distress. But what about if it's the other way around and it's the interviewer, yourself, or a member of your team who starts experiencing distress? I'm going to get to the right page. There you go. We've already mentioned this, I think, in the mural board, but type in the chat again. What are some possible psychological impacts on you as the interviewer or as the data collection team? I think in the mural board, I saw people noting that we might have an emotional response. We may feel sad. And as you can imagine, these response levels now, it's the same questions, but this time turned to us and our team. So it might be that you're supervising a needs assessment or you're there with the team. So how can you handle your own distress during interview? I can see suggestions already coming through. Thank you. Pause, take a pause. You might need to switch out. So Nadia, for example, if I was struggling in this call right now, I might need to say to you, Nadia, do you mind just taking over? I just need to take a break, pause, take some time out. Because perhaps something in the session has caused an emotional response for me. And I think that's where getting to know the team members is really important, and to be aware of maybe the triggers that we have or experiences we had when we feel safe with each other. So I will just share some of our recommendations. I appreciate we've just got about 4 minutes left, so I want to make sure we finish with the key content that we've got here for you. Oh, I've gone to the wrong screen again. I will find the right screen. Yes. Response level 1. So here you might switch roles, pause the interview, take a deep breath, and you may need to limit the number of interviews you do in a day. Perhaps 1 or 2 is all you can manage. And so that's really important to think about too. Yeah, and again, thank you, Anna. Compassion and empathy is really important. There's then also the next level. So this is the level where we're saying, okay, the interview's come to an end. How can you, as an interviewer now, is there anything that might happen during the analysis? So the interview's come to an end, but maybe you've recorded audio of people's stories, or you've got text and you're reading through it, and that might cause another distress for you and your team. What can you do if that happens? Type in the chat. So it's helpful to be aware that distress might not happen just in the interview, it might happen later on for you and your interview team. What can you do if you experience distress during the analysis of the data you've collected? I appreciate for some, you may only have a couple of minutes left because this was the allocated time we had. So I will draw this session to a close. But again, for follow-up, think about if you continue to experience distress or you notice someone in your team, to be aware. Thank you, Abubakar, to have a staff care routine to manage post-exposure stress and to be prepared in that way. Thank you very much. So these are the distress plan guides that we recommend to you. So we have this one for interviewees. So this is for you as the interview team to be aware of for what might be happening for the person you're speaking with. And then we have one on the other side for the interviewer. So these resources we will share with you as a PDF for your reference. If you have any questions and you want to stay on the call, I'm available. We wanted to come back to, did you learn what you wanted to during the webinar? Just very briefly, apologies, Nadia, I've not given you much time. If you want to share your screen and also share the link to the evaluation form for this webinar, that'd be great. Thank you, Nadia. So we have reached the end of the allocated time. Off you go, Nadia. You can mute me and carry on.
Let me just quickly take over then.
So I'm not sure if people are responding yes to the question. If you have any other questions, do type in the chat and we will respond. But Nadia, I'll let you take control.
Okay, it doesn't seem to be working for some reason.
Do I stop share? Oh, you got it.
Can you see my screen?
I'm going to stop sharing and then if you share your screen now.
Okay, let me just do that again real quick. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
Okay, so these are the these were the learning objectives that the participants said they wanted to learn. So understand what the distress plan is, how to conduct a quality assessment, to learn how to obtain consent from participants when conducting research, when and why to obtain informed consent when collecting data, and how to develop a distress plan.
Thank you. We hope we've covered those. As I was referring to later in the session, the principle of do no harm is really key. So if you're not familiar with that, please do put that into Google, because that underpins why we have an obligation to obtain informed consent. And thank you, Nadia. And as we close, Nadia, do you want to talk through the evaluation form that we'd invite you if you've got time, but Nadia, off you go.
Yeah, so we've got a survey that we'd really love for everyone to complete. You don't have to complete the survey, but I will send the link if you can. We're just using the information in this survey just to get feedback and to make sure that we always improve our webinars. So it would be very helpful to get some. Thank you. I'll send the link shortly.
Thank you, Nadia. And Nadia, how much time will it take, do you think, the evaluation form, to complete the evaluation form?
It shouldn't take longer than 2 minutes to complete.
2 minutes, thank you. And how are we going to use that information again? Remind me.
So we're just using it to collect feedback, to improve our webinars, and to understand how effective the webinar has been for our audiences.
Super. Thank you very much. And just to close, for those of you who are still on the call, but we'll share this in the documents, if you want to learn more, we have the Kaya platform lots of resources available for self-directed online learning. And in particular, we highlight these courses that are very relevant, I think, to what we've been looking at today. So thank you so much for joining us today. Really glad to have had you with us. Thank you for engaging. And if you do have any questions, feel free to stay on the call and we can respond additionally. But the call has finished. The webinar has come to an end. Thank you so much for being with us. And Svetlana, Ivona, thank you so much for your interpretations today. Really, really grateful.